these early ideas to be properly critiqued. I wanted nothing lost in the mix, and I wanted everyone to understand why we wanted to do each one of these things. Like metaphor that we kind of think of, I'm trying to lay a really solid foundation here, and maybe sketch out a floor plan, but in no way am I going to show a finished house. I think there's a lesson in that. Baby step. I'm going to come back to it again and again throughout this career. It ensures an entire team, especially a remote team. I was remote. Pocket Watch Games is in San Diego. I live in Maine. It ensures that an entire team can kind of keep up, and it stops problems, small problems, from becoming compounded. I think also if you ensure that an entire team is moving together, you're kind of the experience of making the game, and I think you're more likely to be on the same wavelength in terms of communication. So this mock-up was made with actionability in mind. It only included artwork or features that I knew we could add. There wasn't any bit of art here that made me say oh, well, this is cool, but I don't know how we're going to do this yet. No new questions, only answers. Let's go through some of these things bit by bit. So one suggestion was, instead of those grid blocks in the checkerboard that the game was using before, I suggested we do a fill of much larger textures at the base level of the world, kind of underneath the cliffs and underneath units and stuff, and that was to help reduce patterning, make the world feel a little bit more organic, and get rid of that checkerboard effect. I suggested we use a shader, or even just an old-fashioned overlay image, to shift the color of the terrain so as to get a little bit more color variation, make it feel a little bit more organic. And I suggested some simple atmospheric overlays, so cloud shadows, that scroll across the ground, and animated sun rays on a post-processed tint. This was to help push the value range and make the whole scene feel a little bit more dramatic. There's also some changes here meant to solve some mundane but critical problems. So, an example, Z fighting or bad sorting was a problem with the way the whole terrain worked. Sometimes units would trigger behind squares that they were in front of, and vice versa. So I suggest we paint terrain, or we rather paint cliffs and ramps in such a way that you can never actually get behind them. A lesson for junior artists, or really actually artists, that if you can reduce light bugs for coders, they will love you forever, and do that. So the mock-up was well received, and I don't want to put words into anybody's mouth, but I think everyone kind of felt reinvigorated a little bit. Around this time that Andy said, paraphrased, I always imagine this as a pixel art game. Can we do pixel art? Is that even a good idea? Does that work? How does that change the schedule? Can we do it? I loved that suggestion because Command & Conquer 1, the very first one, was the game I was obsessively playing when I realized it was someone's job to make games, and holy shit, I could be one of those guys. To make a strategy game with big chunky pixels was like a pilgrimage for me. But more important than that personal excitement was the fact that moving Tooth and Tail to a pixel style kind of spoke to the game's soul better. After all, it's a bit of a love letter to those classic 90s strategy games, while also being a little bit of a love letter to some classic arcade games and arcade culture. It also simplified animation production tremendously. Before, it was a bit of an open question of how we would actually produce all of the animation in the game. It would probably require new tech or be expensive. Would we use a 2D rig system? Would we model and animate everything in 3D? Would we do high-res hand-painted animation? Nope. We would use good old-fashioned hand-drawn pixely sprites. We could focus entirely on broad gesture without getting caught in expensive details. Relatively not, it proved to be the perfect foundation on which to build, but I will get to that in just a second, because let's do some lessons first. If you pick an art style that plays to your team's strengths and speaks to your core experience, you reduce the number of visual problems that you actually have to solve. makes you and your team saner because you're not trying to figure out a way to like say X with a visual language that just isn't well equipped to say X. In our case, Pixels spoke to the soul of the game really nicely. It solved a bunch of technical problems, and it was faster to do, so it was A plus for us. And two, a mock-up is a tool, and I think in some cases, in my experience, maybe even most cases, it's the most valuable tool you have. It's not just a painting or a fancy render. It can often give you a leg up on production too, because like the assets you make.
I'll try to mark it as private. I just need to get these screenshots. It's the only way I know how to do it. Got COVID.
It's like, oh, we just have to get this done, and then we can start making. Okay, let's keep going. So, we were all excited about.
You get to hear a lecture. So that's nice for you.
At this point, we started pushing forward on multiple fronts. So Jerome and I dove into character design, just iteration after iteration of line art. This is like the tiniest tip of the iceberg. Goals to show everything we did. It was exhaustive. A bunch of like paintings exploring a bunch of different fun potential. None of these are fun, but fun potential scenarios and emotional themes. I want to make a game just about this dog getting his head shot. That doesn't show up in the game, but it should probably. So the end result of all this work was a nice set of guidelines that dictated the visual design of our units. So units in a given tier, we've got these 3 tiers. Units in a given tier all stand in different poses or have drastically different equipment or weapons, so as to have the silhouette be as informative as possible. Reptiles are primitive. They have less clothing, and they generally have melee attacks. Mammals wear more clothing and are generally ranged. Scale clearly denotes combat effectiveness. One thing that I've learned is that my job as a visual designer, it's not just to design stuff that like looks cool. It's just attention of discipline and creating a consistent visual language, something that has order and patterns and stuff, really helps do that. The mock-up itself became something of a living document. So if anyone had any idea for art, it was iterated a half dozen times in the mock-up before we ever actually put anything in the build. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got from my first art director was, it's cheaper to iterate on paper, and I think this is a version of that. It's maybe also worth mentioning that all of this work I've described so far happened pretty quickly, about the first 2 months. One thing that deal as we were doing all of this was slightly exhaustive visual communication among the team, little storyboards, if you will, that kind of describe tech needs or how a sequence of events should work. Since we didn't have a lot of time, we couldn't afford to lose time due to miscommunication. So if we were ever kind of talking about a complex topic, we would do something up like this to make sure that all of these ideas were like completely thoroughly understood. I can't understand the value of this of my wider career. I've worked with like a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different spaces. Certainly teams like Pocket Watch, but also teams in academia, research teams, marketing teams.
Oh, this guy's quite nice.
Kind of everybody communicates a little bit differently. So working to convey a single idea in like multiple different ways helps ensure that that idea is going to be understood regardless of what kind of communicator is on the other end. Taking a little bit of time to communicate clearly, in my experience, helps prevent miscommunication, which can be like super.
Oh, this guy's like a friendly wizard.
But we eventually had to move from these like nice-looking mock-ups and start putting the stuff in the game and wrestle with like the 2 or 3 weeks where the game looked like an awkward teenager, which is what this is right here. So at this point, I proceeded to create at least one of every major asset type in the game. So at least one commander, at least one unit, at least one building. And the goal was twofold. One, to get like a little bit of first-hand experience and understanding of like the assumed art pipelines. And so we could identify the weak points in that tech, but also I needed to know how long it was going to take to make each one of these things, because we needed to build a schedule that was based on something besides just gut estimates. And there's a lesson in that. Uncertainty is, in my experience, just about your worst enemy. Experience is always better than an educated guess, and the longer I have let blind spots live, the more time they've cost me in the end. So, again, in my experience, it's best to remove those blind spots as early as possible. So, at the onset of these tests, I was thinking, like, okay, great, this is a pixel art game. I can do everything in Photoshop. I can have a nice, neat, like, single piece of software tool chain. And since we're dealing with tiny resolutions, I can basically just make a small PSD, like 480 by 270 pixels, and just paint all the environmental assets right in there without worrying about going through memory. Everything would look consistent because it's all like just painted right there in the same scene. And in the end, that is how we produce all the environmental assets in the game. I have a PSD with no joke between 2,000 and 3,000 layers that just has bam every environmental asset that's in the game. But these early pipeline tests showed us that animation was still going to kill us. And even after the move to pixels, it was still going to kill us. Now, it's worth mentioning that one of my goals for the animation was that I wanted really lively, kind of organic, nuanced animation, and not like the limited frames, no in between approach usually associated with traditional pixel art. And the reason I wanted to do that was because one of the conditions of moving to pixels was that we had to be sure we did it in a way where we couldn't be written off as just another indie pixel. I hate this animation. So in theory, the move to pixels actually made that goal of like really nice animation more achievable. Like I said before, we could focus entirely on big broad gesture. We didn't have to get caught in details. We could have all the in-betweens I wanted. We could do it right at Chickadee. We didn't have to like hire an army of French animators. But animating in Photoshop for me is like so cumbersome, and I know it is a bad artist that blames his tools, but there's
Okay,
no way to like.
And come back to you later and work on the slides.
Quickly move between frames and I'm talking about like the rough animation, not painting